Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is author and Journal of the American Revolution contributor Shawn McGhee, and he'll be discussing the early ideological wars that were waged in early American newspapers. Shawn, thank you for coming back.
Thank you so much, Brady. I'm always excited to share my thoughts on my research, and I'm glad to have someone who's interested to hear.
Shawn, you're a friend of the show. You've been on really a whole bunch of times. For those people who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. So I have a PhD from Temple University. I'm primarily a historian of the politics and political culture of the Revolutionary and early national periods. I teach history at Moore College of Art and Design in Philadelphia, as well as teach history at the secondary level in New Jersey. I am the author of No Longer Subjects of the British King, The Political Transformation of Royal Subjects to Republican Citizens, which is ultimately my revised dissertation. I'm also a regular contributor to the JAR, and it's good to be back on Dispatches, and I'm looking forward to our conversation, Brady.
Absolutely. And it's a wonderful book, by the way. I wanted to say that. So, Shawn, you made a choice in this episode. We're actually not talking about one article, but a series of articles. And tell us kind of a little bit about that decision, why you chose to expand it to 3. You know, you've almost got a short book here, I think, I think in a lot of ways. So tell us a little bit about maybe the nuts and bolts of this. Why did you feel like 3 articles or a series of articles was the way to go here?
Yeah, so this is an idea that I had been thinking about for a long time. This goes back to really the early 2000s. I remember really paying attention to the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. And it was, I don't want to say that it was a political coming of age, but, you know, it was a moment where I was beginning to recognize that depending on where you get your information, you're going to have it served to you a bit differently. And, you know, whether it's through the New York Times, which I was reading, or the Wall Street Journal, which I was reading, or if it was through, you know, The Nation or the National Review, or if you were just watching television, if you were watching Fox News or if you were watching MSNBC, the people who you are rooting for seem to be represented in the most positive of lights, and the people that you're not necessarily rooting for, and I you know, I don't mean any offense by rooting, but, you know, the general term, are not reflected in the best way. And I feel that sort of, so if you were watching Fox, for example, you know, George W. Bush was doing a great job. If you were watching MSNBC, he wasn't. When Obama was elected, if you're watching MSNBC, he's doing a good job. And if you're watching Fox News, he wasn't. And, you know, it's not my intention to become or to really have a discourse on contemporary politics, but that's where the idea came from. And I began thinking to myself, like, this can't be the first time that we've had such a blatantly hyper-partisan press, right? And of course, it's my opinion that it's only gotten even more partisan. But that's not the purpose of our conversation today. So I began wondering, like, has the press always been this way? You know, and certainly if you go back to the antebellum period, you're going to have like pro-Southern press and, you know, pro-Northern press. But I started digging around in the area that I'm familiar with, and I came across the 2 closest approximations that we have of a national press. And the first one was by this Bostonian, a gentleman by the name of John Fenno, who begins publishing a paper called the Gazette of the United States. And as a direct response to Fenno's publication, another character named Philip Freneau is sort of coerced into putting together a sort of anti-administration, pro-opposition press called the National Gazette. So it was there that I began to look in seeing sort of dueling narratives, if you will, of the early Republican period. And I think the most remarkable part is this sort of these press wars begin to unfold before the first Washington administration is even over. Like by about 1791, we're beginning to see cracks in the veneer of Washington's reputation. I know that, you know, history is studied looking backward, but it's lived looking forward, right? When we look at it, we're like, oh, of course, Washington's on Mount Rushmore. He's on the quarter. He's on the dollar. You know, no one's ever said a bad thing about him. you go back to 1791, and there are plenty of people that are willing to say some pretty bad things, particularly about his administration, but eventually him as well. So that's the genesis of the idea.
Yeah, fortunately, we don't have to worry about hyper partisanship in the press anymore. Uh, uh, so let's start with Article 1 a bit. We focus on John Fenno, who you've introduced. What should we know about him? Tell us a little bit about his background.
So John Fenno, he comes from a struggling. I guess we would categorize him today as like lower middle class background. His father Ephraim was a leather dresser. It seems that his mother was a homemaker, and the father is chronically struggling to sort of obtain or achieve that elusive social mobility. And I think that when we tell the American story to our students, I mean, we all went through a similar secondary education. When Americans think about social mobility, we think that the sky's the limit. And I think that if there's ever been a positive example of like indoctrination, I think that's a great one, right? We are told that we can get beyond our starting point. And I think that that's just a healthy thing to tell students. But what we neglect to recognize or to flesh out is that social mobility is not a one-way street. There's downward mobility as well, and it seems to me that the Fennos were part of this sort of like incremental downward mobility. John Fenno struggles as the revolutionary moment becomes militarized. He joins Artemus Ward's staff for a little while until Ward retires in 1777. Fenno benefits from education at the Old South Writing School, where he eventually teaches as well. So Fenno appears to be a deeply educated, incredibly curious person that has a powerful intellect and an insane work ethic. And he strikes upon this idea that after the revolutionary moment is over and the revolution is sort of channeling its political energy into the constitutional battles, he gets the idea that his calling is really going to be someone who produces a nationally available news organ that will both speak for the government and to the people. So he sort of imagines himself as like this political philosopher, this political medium for the American people, where he will sort of share with them what's going on nationally. And I hope to talk a bit more about that when we get into the conversation.
Yeah, so Fenno is going to add a lot to the conversation about the Constitution, maybe making a case for the Constitution. He seems to want to be an influencer more than just a reporter. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so Fenno, today he would be a reporter and a printer and an editor all in the same person. I divided these papers up into John Fenno's private crusade for a national identity and John Fenno's public crusade. The first paper was dealing with the very real personal sacrifice that this man endured while he was pursuing his objective. I mean, he loses two young daughters. He moves from Boston to first New York and then Philadelphia when the seat of government moves. It's at a tremendous financial cost, emotional cost. His father is put in an almshouse until he eventually passes away. His sister dies. He leaves Boston. He leaves the place that shaped him and formed him into the man that he became, and he never gets back there. So this is a true believer. This is a man that believes, or who believes, that he has something to offer, and that his private sacrifice is going to be worth it for the public. The second paper deals with the sort of the public narrative, right? And so this is not a partisan press in the way that we imagine it. There is no competitor, so he didn't set out to be partisan in the traditional sense. This is before there are national parties. In fact, this is a point in time when Americans don't yet have the intellectual equipment to recognize that you can be loyal to the country and to the Constitution and also be an opponent of the people who are actually operating that institution or those institutions, right? So we We have that in hindsight. Again, history is studied looking backwards. They didn't. So Fenno imagines that he's going to start this newspaper and he's going to reveal all the benefits of the federal Constitution. And he really has, and this is my reading from like I took the train into Philadelphia, and I sit in the library company of Philadelphia, and I read for hours and hours and hours, several times a week, through these newspapers. And it seems to me that there are at least three objectives that he has, right? But they're sort of interlocking. He wants to first and foremost make certain that everyone understands the benefits of the Constitution. He wants to make certain that people are deferring or providing the proper deference to national figures and national laws. And he wants to promote the Union. That's really it. It doesn't matter if it's a Washington administration, a Jefferson administration. He sees the federal Constitution as the most important next step in establishing a permanent nation. And if you'll give me one more moment to speak on like just how deeply this man thought, he recognized the role that print, or the printing press played, rather, in creating permanent and sustainable political communities. He equally recognized that nations have lifespans, right? Like we come home from work each day. You have one address. You plan for college, you plan for your career, and we can do that with the expectation that our house will be there, that our way of life is sustainable and predictable. But it hasn't always been like that, right? Really, since the post-World War II era, have we gotten to this sense of stability. And so Fenno recognized that nations, not all of them survive, and that the United States was in this nebulous moment where it could be swept off in a heartbeat. And so he recognized that it was the press. It was the press that was going to be the connective tissue that was going to draw together Americans from as far away as Massachusetts all the way to Georgia. And he was inviting every American into a national drama, addressing what I call in the papers a literary citizenry. He was activating these people. And what he was reporting on became as descriptive as it was prescriptive for the American experience. And so he expected that he would normalize people respecting the federal Constitution and realizing its importance in keeping the nation together. He expected to normalize people having the proper degree of deference for national figures and their legislation. And he expected through those first two objectives to achieve the third one, which would be a permanent and perpetual union that provided security, liberty, and dignity for all American subjects.
Shawn, when you look at Fenno's work, as you said, he was really, again, prescriptive in what he was saying. What were some of the challenges that he saw at the time that he thought could be problems maybe down the road or even in the short term that were a threat to this young nation?
Yeah, so if anyone ever has the opportunity to, I'm pretty sure that you can find PDFs online. But if you ever have the opportunity to just take a look at the first article, the first paper that he releases. I think it's April 15th, 1789. It's a couple weeks before Washington is sworn in. And he gives you the mission statement of his paper. And if you're familiar with his private papers, his mission statement, like he embodies his private thoughts, and like it's very difficult to tell where the private man ends and the public man begins. But he sees that the ship of state is not safe. The American Revolution created something; it didn't sustain anything. And so he sees that the next challenge that lie ahead is being able to handle a world of incredibly aggressive autocrats and monarchs that would desperately like to see the republic fail. He was warning Americans that the federal Constitution was new and untested. And with this new and untested form of government, the first national actors had to figure out how to protect the territorial integrity of the republic, how to navigate and negotiate commerce in a hostile world, how to make certain that the United States was able to pay its debts, both domestic and foreign, and make supporters out of people that want their money back from the United States, all with this untested Constitution. And so, like he says in that first issue of the Gazette of the United States, we need all hands on deck. And Americans need to recognize that there are true sages, and those sages are the men who found themselves. Now, you don't know, of course, anyone listening, you don't need to believe this stuff. This is just what he believed. Of course, we know that the truth and the facts don't always ride in the same train. But it was his truth, and it was his truth that the federal experiment was on rocky beginnings. The ship of state was not out of the storm, and the Constitution was the last best hope that the new United States had to sort of escape from. If you were a thinker like Fenno, the unbridled democratic impulses of the 1780s. And so he sees that all those troubles that are facing the nation, both internal and external, have to be navigated with a new and untested instrument, and everyone needs to have all hands on deck. And by the way, he calls out North Carolina and Rhode Island for not ratifying the federal Constitution. He claims that one of them is like suffering from conspiratorial delusions, and the other state is just getting bad information, and they need to get over it. Because the federal government can't protect them, and he calls Washington the American Fabius Maximus can't protect those states either. So they need to, and he actually calls them foreign states. He calls Rhode Islanders and North Carolinians foreigners. And then the other 11 are the sister states within the constitutional protections of the new American Fabius, and these individuals who are being lied to and suffering from conspiratorial delusions need to get with it and get in the union and make it firm and strong and join in with the sea of troubles that are coming ahead for Americans.
Yeah, Shawn, whenever I looked at this, I saw so much of ourselves in this. I can remember in the 2024 election, there was this discussion amongst the Democratic Party recently, that there was loud voices on YouTube, individuals that had big platforms, and Democrats were saying, well, we were behind on that. We should have had our own voice on the web, that people, influencers for that name. So we see in your articles some familiar names pop up: James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. They actually have conversations about trying to have maybe a more conservative voice, what would become the Democratic Republican voice. Talk about Philip Freneau, kind of how he plays into this, maybe balancing the scales.
So Freneau Freneau led a pretty interesting life. He does not come from the same space on the socioeconomic bracket that Fenno did. And apologies to the listeners, these names are very similar, right? The pro-Washington character is John Fenno, and the pro-Jeffersonian / opposition character is Philip Freneau, of a family of French Huguenots. Freneau goes to the College of New Jersey, which today rather is Princeton. He becomes friends with Hugh Breckinridge and James Madison. They are part of this Clio club where it's supposed to be a space for like literary discussion, but they use it as a sort of debate platform to discuss imperial politics. He ends up getting he joins the revolution. He's like part of the New Jersey militia. He gets onto a vessel, and he becomes a prisoner of war for a little while. He writes his most famous, I think it's his most famous poem, where he's a prisoner of war in a British prison ship. And he did some work. He dabbled as a reporter for a little while. And by about 1791, or rather, let me reframe that, up until about 1791, John Fenno hasn't ruffled too many feathers. He's quietly going about his work. He eventually gets a contract to do the Senate printing. He gets a contract to do most of the printing for the executive branch. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson's State Department extends some contracts to him. So this is naturally before Jefferson is suspicious of the man. Now, about 1791, when Fenno, it becomes apparent to Jefferson, has become a full-throated supporter of everything that the Washington administration does. Jefferson begins looking for what he called a, quote, Whig vehicle of intelligence. And James Madison and Thomas Jefferson begin to put tremendous pressure on Philip Freneau. and they want him to relocate from, I forget exactly where he was at the time. He may have been in New Jersey, but they want him to come to New York. And Jefferson writes this sort of cryptic letter saying, "Hey, there's a printing position available in the State Department. It requires very little work. All you need to know is a little bit of French, and there's very little work to do, which would allow you a lot of time to do other things." And that's, it's pretty clear that there must have been some communication prior to that communication, right? Prior to that letter, because what other things means is unless they spoke about it, could be anything. But it's very clear that, hey, you can work a few hours a day and then spend the rest of your time ravaging the Washington administration, and it would be amazing. And so eventually Freneau agrees. He agrees that if his friend gets the printing contract to print his paper, if he accrues no losses, and should any materialize, and if he can have shares in any potential profits, if he gets those three compromises or concessions, he would do it. And Jefferson and Madison agree to it, and Philip Freneau comes to New York, and they wage war against one another. And it's pretty interesting. I wish it would have played a larger role in the paper, but I had to just tuck it away in a footnote. These two characters, Freneau and Fenno, wage a literary war against one another in the partisan press for years. And what they write, their words, have real world implications, and they're shaping the national discourse from one city. And what's even more incredible, and this is tucked away in a footnote, I think footnote 38, they're working like a few blocks from one another. Like, they're both on High Street, and Fenno is on 3rd Street, 3rd and High, and Freneau is on 6th and High. So from these two, they're a couple blocks from one another, but there's national implications for what these characters are writing.
Yeah, Shawn, I mean, from your viewpoint, it's hard to gauge this. Do you think Freneau's work was the maybe counterbalancing force that men like Jefferson were hoping it would be? How does that work out?
For a little while, by about 1796, 1797, Jeffersonians are beginning to pull support away from Freneau. But in the beginning, they get everything that they want. I mean, if Fenno's objectives were to make Americans understand the benefits of the Constitution, to make Americans defer to national characters and national legislation, and to support the Union, Freneau's objectives were a little different. He wanted to sort of promote the importance of state government, the importance of state actors, and I think primarily he wanted Americans to remain deeply skeptical of any federal initiatives. So rather than deference, he wants every American to just not trust at face value whatever is coming out of not only Fenno's paper, but anywhere, really. So he wants to create an army of like literary sentinels, right, that are sort of hanging on every word in the press and are deeply involved. Now, Jefferson is incredibly excited about Freneau's paper because Freneau is willing to attack Washington's policies. I mean, one of the first things that they do is they go all in against Hamilton's funding and assumption plan. They go all in against the whiskey excise. They go all in against Hamilton's society to establish useful manufacturers. So there is a counterpoint to the sort of national mythology that Fenno is trying to create through the Gazette of the United States, and it's being challenged directly from a few blocks away from a Jeffersonian thinker. But again, like by about 1796, 1797, this is really the Citizen Genet affair, where Freneau seems to not think that there's a problem with this French character coming over and ignoring George Washington, ignoring the Neutrality Proclamation, and trying to recruit American sailors to become engaged in the French Revolutionary Wars. And that's when people start to begin to lose faith. Not everyone, but certainly, like, even Jefferson, who's the consummate politician, he early on recognizes that Freneau, by about 96, 97, is becoming political baggage.
So, Shawn, as you mentioned, we don't have political parties yet. we know they're coming. They didn't. Maybe not as clearly as we understand them today. What do you think this sort of war of words, if you want to call it that, reveals to us about maybe the ideological divide that's beginning to emerge in early America?
Well, I think that it sort of more than anything just reveals that there was always a very powerful division in the United States, and it adds to this what I call in the paper the politics of apocalypticism. Um, these are actors that do not have experience in one party assuming power and then another party assuming power and vice versa, right? So their only frame of reference with parties as they understood them then was that one will live and the other will die, right? If we go back to the American Revolution, there were Whigs and there were Tories. And after the American Revolution secured independence for Whigs, you could be mad about that. But your fundamental purpose for political organization can no longer be to keep the colonies within the British Empire. The next common battle they have is with the federal constitution, right? The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And after the federal constitution is ratified, you can be mad as hell about that. But your fundamental purpose for political organization can no longer be to make certain that the constitution is not ratified. So one party survives and the other one doesn't. And so when they're involved and when these two camps begin to divide, there's a clear recognition, an assumption, I would go as far as to say, that once the Federalists or this new opposition are defeated in the polls, that'll be it. I mean, that's where we get, like, if we go a little further on, the era of good feelings, right? Like, the era of good feelings, there are no Federalists left, right? That's why it felt so good. They finally achieved one party rule. Of course, it doesn't last very long, but that was the sort of operating assumption that parties, parties are dangerous. Parties are cancer. You can't support the country that you live in and not support the government who governs it, right? It's really not going to be until characters like Martin Van Buren begin to have a relatively modern understanding of like embracing parties as maximizing political participation. That's not what it was in the 1790s. It was clearly one side is right, and clearly the other side is evil and wants to destroy the United States, right? So if you're like Washington and John Fenno and Alexander Hamilton, you're pretty certain that Jefferson and Madison and Freneau want to destroy the federal architecture and devolve into some sort of proto-anarchy or become a stooge for the French. And if you're Jefferson and Madison and Freneau, you're pretty damn convinced that Washington and Hamilton and Fenno are secretly trying to create a monarchy on the rubble of the Constitution. And you have these two parties that, they are fighting to the death. They're fighting for their political survival, and they're fighting for what they think is the legacy and the liberal bounty of the American Revolution.
Well, Shawn, we always like to end with this question. It kind of wraps things up neatly for us. How do you think this article helps us understand the Revolutionary era better? It largely takes place after the war, but it's right in there.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is just the revolution in its constitutional form, right? And I think if this trilogy of articles tells us anything about the revolutionary period, it's that there's never been one interpretation of it, right? We have a lot of people that like to say, well, what would the founders think, right? This is what the founders would have done. No one founder spoke for the founders. No one founder spoke for the founders any more than either of the two of us speak for our present generation. You have your opinions, I have mine, and we certainly don't speak for every American. So what this paper proves more than anything is that even for the people who lived through the American Revolution, there was never a single interpretation of it, right? What the revolution meant, its contours and limits, who was in, who was out, and how best to sort of harness its sort of motivating power. It was never a settled upon thing. The men who fought the revolution fought one another after the revolution for who controlled it and who controlled the narrative.
Wonderful. Shawn, great as always. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brady. Always great.